So in the previous video, we were using an ESP32 wired up to our heat pump in order to extract useful data which can be used to determine how well our heat pump is performing. We're going to continue with the data analysis in this video.
And what do we have here? Outdoor temperature, this line here. You can see we were having some frosts overnight. We've got the indoor temperature, and this is very interesting. So this setting which I had of just using leaving water temperature and weather dependent curve for setting your output, it maintained a fairly constant temperature inside the house. That's really very good. What else have we got? This yellow and green line, this is interesting. One is the leaving water target temperature and one is the actual leaving water temperature. And you can see it had a pretty, the leaving water temperature was slowly climbing up, and it was climbing up in step with the outdoor temperature dropping down. And we were having some difficulty at the beginning. You could see that we had these overshoots, and every time you get this overshoot, once it gets too much, the compressor cuts out and it drops down to 0. And then we get overshoot again, and then it cuts out, and then it manages to get the leaving water temperature back down. So if we look at this graph here, this is your input power consumption and your output, your produced power. It was trying to reduce the power output when the leaving water temperature was too high, but it couldn't quite do it. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that there seems to be a minimum power consumption for the inverter. The lowest I've seen it over a long period of time is 2.3 amps of current. That's about 560 watts, I think. And that's interesting in the sense that it can't drop any further in terms of output. And when the weather's cold, like it is in this region, that's fine. It's in a happy element. It's in a happy zone. But when the air temperature here, it was about 8 or 9 degrees. That's too high for continuous operation. So it just continues to overshoot the leaving temperature, and then it cuts out, overshoots and cuts out before the temperature starts to drop down to a reasonable level. Now, what's going on here? I'm not too sure. I think this is defrost cycling. As you can see, we're at freezing point, but it was fairly steady in this regime here. This big upswing here, that is your domestic hot water coming into play. So it was trying to bring up the domestic hot water. I haven't charted the domestic hot water, but I do have it logged here. So it brought it up from 42 degrees Celsius up to 47.6 degrees Celsius, and the set point for hot water is 47 degrees. So it was doing its job, and it managed to do that within about, how long? 30 minutes. So not too bad. And you can see we got some pretty low temperatures. I think about minus 3.5 degrees at 6:30 in the morning. That was the coldest point. And we were consuming at that point about 1000 watts. And you can see there's been a lot of cycling. I think this is defrost cycling here. So temperature this morning is minus 3.5. What you can see here is frost building up here. So there will probably be a defrost cycle at some point this morning, but hopefully it will warm up before that time. Let's look at the coefficient of performance. So it's about 3 degrees, and then it drops down to coefficient of performance, which is about 2.5 to 3. It floats around at a temperature of minus 4. And to be honest, look at the nameplate capacity of this. It's got a coefficient of performance rating of about, I think it's 3.2 at 2 degrees Celsius. and at -7 degrees Celsius it's got a coefficient of performance nameplate of about 1.9 something. So this is right on the money.
There is something else which is right on the money, which makes me really chuffed about this heat pump and my own estimations. And that was the heat loss calculations which I made for my first video in this series. Let's go and take a closer look at that.
Okay, so we've got two regimes to have a look at, one of which is this regime here. You can see here we've got a temperature difference of about 17 degrees between the inside and outside temperatures. That corresponds to about 2,200 watts of power. This was a nice steady region of time. 2,200 watts of power to keep my house at a nice steady temperature of 21 degrees. Let's bring in this spreadsheet here. Document which I use to calculate the heat loss from my house. So this number in the bottom right corner is the calculated heat loss. These are facts here, but the drafts, this is all speculation. If I remove the drafts, we get a total heat loss of 2,000 watts. That is right on the money for an inside-outside temperature difference of 17 degrees. That makes me really chuffed. That shows me that these calculations are worth something. It's not just a black art to calculating heat losses in a building, and this kind of information validates my calculations. If we look here, this is nice and steady. It's about 2,500 watts or thereabouts, and that is for a temperature gradient which is a bit lower, 22 degrees. You know, I'm really pleased with this number. I'm really pleased with this spreadsheet. I think I'll probably upload this onto my Google Drive and make it available to all you lot, and then you can play around to your heart's content and see what you make of it.
Now, I can switch off anti-frost cycling if I want to, but as you saw in that video, it is not wise to do so. There is actual frosting, which is icing, which is building up. But the thing which is of more interest is how the heat pump recovers after the anti-frost cycling. There's a lot of instability and there's a lot of cutouts, and it takes quite some time to stabilize things before you get to the next anti-frost cycle. So that is interesting. We don't have any frosts coming up very soon, so we're going to have to wait some time. Hopefully not until next winter. We are in springtime after all. So what we saw in the graphs was that there was an overshoot following a recovery from the defrost cycles. And what that resulted in was the heat pump cutting out far sooner than it really should have done. So let's change into the installer settings one more time. Let's go into space heating and cooling. Now we've got this setting here. It's called increase around 0 degrees Celsius. It was set by default to this. So what this does is that it increases your flow temperature by 2 degrees, and it increases the tolerance of your flow temperature by plus or minus 2 degrees. So this was creating some uncertainty, so I thought. So I selected it to no, and the other thing I looked at was the overshoot. So this is the overshoot for the flow temperature. It was set to 1 degree Celsius. If you look at the analysis, it was cutting out 1 degree Celsius above the flow set point. So I've increased that to 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the interesting thing was that when I back out of this, eventually you get to a stage where you're asked to restart. And when you restart, what happened was that the machine rebooted, as you'd expect, but this blue light up here, it turned red. And that indicated that a fault had applied. So what I did was that I looked at the fault notice in here. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was an AH-00 code, and it told me that the disinfection routine had failed to complete. Now, my heat pump is set to disinfect on Saturday morning at midnight for 40 minutes.
So here we can see what happened during the disinfection cycle on the first night. This line here, the dark brown line, represents the actual temperature of the hot water tank, and it has to get up to 60 degrees Celsius. So what you can see is that it climbs up quite happily using the compressor to provide the heat. As you can see here, we've got the input power here, which is going up to about 3 kilowatts. It maxes out at about 14 amps. And you can see the produced power here. So it's got no problem getting up to this kind of level. And once it gets to precisely 52.8 degrees Celsius, the compressor cuts out.
And what I then did was that I went into the tank settings here, and we go into disinfection. What I did was that I changed the tank duration to 1 hour instead of 60 minutes. Now, even though it had cut out after just 20 minutes of heating instead of 40 minutes, that was very strange. You can't change this set point here, so that's not available. So what I did was that I did that, and I changed the start time to 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the Saturday. And sure enough, the disinfection started again, but it only lasted for a few minutes.
Now, if you see what happens on the second time, this is when I had it for disinfection at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We had lots of sunshine, so I thought, why not? So again, you can see we are getting the power ramping up to 3000 watts in terms of input, and in terms of output, we get quite a sluggish response in terms of power output. But you can see that the temperature is ramping up, and it ramps up to precisely 52.8 degrees Celsius before the compressor is cutting out. Now, 52.8 degrees Celsius for hot water in both instances does not sound like a coincidence to me. This green line here shows you the actual flow temperature of the heating medium in the coil. So that's reaching 60 degrees Celsius here. It's not quite reaching 60 degrees Celsius here.
So after seeing that it had failed one more time, I then went back into the settings, and this time I had this idea that maybe when the temperature of the hot water is required to go above a certain temperature, it requires a backup heater. So I went back into installer settings. I went to the backup heater. You remember last time that I set it to an operation mode of being restricted. This one up here. I've now changed it so that it's now allowed to come on only for domestic hot water. I then did that. I then reset the disinfection time for midnight on Sunday, and woohoo, the disinfection worked this time.
So after the second failure, as you can see, the coefficient of performance is really poor. We've got a good amount of power output here, over 4 kilowatts, and it ramps up to over 5 kilowatts in the first instance. Then it ramps down, so it's just on the compressor here, and then it ramps up again here, and that achieves your actual goal here. Interestingly, you can see that the power input here goes all the way back down to 3 kilowatts. Produced power is less than 3 kilowatts. That tells me the compressor's not running, which is interesting. And but it's the interesting thing is that the heating medium temperature was ramping up above 65 degrees Celsius. So that gives me some very interesting insights. There seems to be a hard cutout at 52.8 degrees Celsius. for the hot water tank when it comes to compressor only heating. Now, I'm going to say 52.8 degrees Celsius is hot enough to kill Legionella. It doesn't kill it as fast as it does at 60 degrees Celsius, but we do maintain a temperature above 50 degrees Celsius for a long time. So from 12:20 p.m. until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, indeed until midnight the following night, we had temperatures above 50 degrees. I think that's sufficient to do this. And yet we're not able to adjust the disinfection temperature. So it seems like the backup heater is essential to do the disinfection routine.
I am wondering whether we should just simply switch off the disinfection cycle and just simply have a manual set point of 55 degrees Celsius on one particular night using a regular schedule. That is entirely possible. So all told, I think the tuning for my heat pump is around about 95% good. I've adjusted the weather dependent compensation curve further. We have got sustained temperatures in the house of about 22 degrees Celsius, which is a bit too warm, especially at night time. What I probably am going to do is reintroduce thermostatic control. And the reason for doing so is because we don't want temperatures going too high, especially during the daytime, because there's one thing which weather compensation will not do. It will not add any bias for solar gain. So it's very good control in the nighttime and in cloudy days, but on a sunny day in March or February for that matter, it is going to be a case where you probably want to switch off your heat pump altogether. The other thing that's interesting is that the 100% load is about 14 amps, which is about 3.3 kilowatts. If we look at the data sheets at a temperature of -7 degrees, you've got a coefficient of performance of about 1.9. So at -10 degrees Celsius, your maximum output from your compressor only situation is going to be about 5.5 kilowatts. So if you need a heat output which is more than 5.5 kilowatts, you're going to need to use the backup heaters. So that's very interesting. You look at the data sheets, it says it's rated at 8 kilowatts at -10 degrees Celsius, but that's with the backup heater. On its own, it cannot achieve that 8 kilowatt output at -10. That said, I think the most pressing issue when it comes to stable and efficient control is frosting, icing up in the cold nights. There's a lot of energy which is needed to remove the ice, and I start to wonder to myself, are there other ways of preventing ice accretion? You can get coatings which you can spray on, which repel water, and by extension probably also repel ice. I do wonder whether they will start to apply these coatings to their heat exchange fins in the future. There are of course many questions to ask. Does it negatively impact heat transfer? Does it have any impacts in terms of corrosion? Does it even last a long time? And does it survive cleaning routines that you probably have to do in order to get rid of any growth of mold and algae, which will build up over time? These are all interesting questions, but all told, there's one more crucial test. In fact, the most important test for this heat pump. Okay, Rachel, what do you think?
Cosy, very cosy indeed. Much better than the Arctic that previously was.
Yeah. Well, come on, I did have a wood-burning stove and I still do.
Yeah, but you didn't put it on. It was still Arctic most of the time, but no, very cosy indeed.
But you're still wearing a coat. Do you want to take your coat off?
Yes, it's still cosy.
Very cosy.
22 degrees.
22 degrees, and it's cosy throughout the entire house as well.
And it's the first time I've seen 22 degrees in this house.
No, you've seen it before. Come on.
Not often, not this year, because you were running down your aisle. So you didn't do the wood burning stove.
No, I didn't do the wood burning stove, but I was sort of...
Yeah, you were running down your aisle, so you didn't use the wood burning stove.
Okay.
Very cosy indeed.
All right, Rachel.
I think we can say, well, that's me told, but it's all in the past, all of this cold house nonsense. We've got a nice warm house now, and that's going to make Rachel happy, and I'm pretty sure that when it comes to an investment decision for a heat pump, making sure your girlfriend or wife is happy is the most important consideration when it comes to having a heat pump. I'm going to have to say, I bought this to try and save some money, but I will also admit that my house is so much more comfortable. As we can see here, let's just see, yeah, 22.5 degrees Celsius, and I've been trying to adjust these weather compensation curves down all the time to try and make this house cooler more than anything else, and that's going to be interesting. So that's it for this video. In my next video, we are going to be talking about money. That's going to be a subject matter which most people will be very interested in. None of this technical geekery, interesting though it is for people like myself. Cold, hard cash is what we are going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the grants, how much I paid, and the overall process of trying to reclaim that grant money. So I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will talk to you again very soon.